The first excerpt will be read by Joe Conover. Joe?
If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made, that is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare. It's because being an American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy, and this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith, we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption we feared at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it, we found the power to author a new chapter.
Scott will now read the words of Frederick Douglass from The Unknown Royal Dead, and will move into his talk directly, entitled, If Rome Must Fall, We Are Innocent. The Lessons of Loss and Hope from the Civil War. Scott?
Thank you, Iris. As Iris said, this is from Frederick Douglass's address on Decoration Day, May 30th, 1871, at the New Arlington National Cemetery. Those unknown heroes who have been piously gathered here, and whose green graves we now strew with sweet and beautiful flowers, choice emblems alike of pure hearts and brave spirits, reached in their glorious career that last highest point of nobleness beyond which human power cannot go. They died for their country. When the dark and vengeful spirit of slavery, always ambitious, preferring to rule in hell than serve in heaven, fired the Southern heart and stirred all the malign elements of discord, when our great republic, the hope of freedom and self-government throughout the world, had reached the point of supreme peril, when the union of these states was torn and rent asunder at the center, and the armies of a gigantic rebellion came forth with broad blades and bloody hands to destroy the very foundations of American society. The unknown braves who flung themselves into the yawning chasm where cannon roared and bullets whistled, fought and fell. They died for their country. We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle, and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. I am no minister of malice. I would not strike the fallen. I would not repel the repentant. But may my right hand forget her cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I forget the difference between the parties to that terrible, protracted, and bloody conflict. If we ought to forget a war which has filled our land with widows and orphans, which has made stumps of men of the very flower of our youth, which has sent them on the journey of life armless, legless, maimed and mutilated, which has piled up a debt heavier than a mountain of gold, swept uncounted thousands of men into bloody graves, and planted agony at 1,000,000 hearthstones, I say, if this war is to be forgotten, I ask, in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember? The essence and significance of our devotions here today are not to be found in the fact that the men whose remains fill these graves were brave in battle. If we met simply to show our sense of bravery, we should find enough on both sides to kindle admiration. In the raging storm of fire and blood, in the fierce torrent of shot and shell, of sword and bayonet, whether on foot or on horse, unflinching courage marked the rebel not less than the loyal soldier. But we are not here to applaud manly courage, save as has been displayed in this noble cause. We must never forget that victory to the rebellion meant death to the republic. We must never forget that the loyal soldiers who rest beneath this sod flung themselves between the nation and the nation's destroyers. If today we have a country not boiling in agony of blood like France, if we now have a united country no longer cursed by the hell-black system of human bondage, if the American name is no longer a byword and a hissing to a mocking earth, if the Star-Spangled Banner floats only over free American citizens in every quarter of the land, and our country has before it a long and glorious career of justice, liberty, and civilization, we are indebted to the unselfish devotion of the noble army who rest in these honored graves all around us. Certainly, it was a challenge for me trying to think about what to say, having just finished 2020 and then being asked to speak on desolation and loss. While there was no shortage of material, certainly, it's hard to zero in on a topic in a year or in a time right now that is full of so much desolation and loss, and so many people searching for consolation. So I thought it made some sense to have to choose. I thought the two different directions to go here were obviously to focus on the Republic, and that drew me back to the Civil War, or to think about COVID and the loss that we've all suffered as a nation in terms of the 450,000 plus individuals we've lost. And I simply decided I like the Civil War better. I'm tired of COVID. I thought I would focus on the Civil War and the Republic and that angle on consolation and loss. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. By the middle 1850s, James Shannon, the well-known pro-slavery minister, key figure in the mid-19th century Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and to people in this region, better known as the first president of Christian University, now Culver Stockton College. By the mid-1850s, he seemed to know that a conflict was coming. In fact, he seemed to be relishing in the fact that a conflict was coming. Shannon was a major figure in education in 19th century America, and he was also a major figure in the pro-slavery movement. He wrote numerous books on the biblical justification of slavery, was a very well-known figure nationally for his views on slavery. And the closer the war got, the more Southern apologists and fire eaters gravitated toward the position of people like Shannon, who had a biblical justification ready to roll out for the continuance of a system of bondage. But he was also an educator. He was the president of Centenary College in Louisiana and Bacon College in Kentucky before becoming the second ever president of the University of Missouri, and then eventually moving to Canton to become president of what is now Culver Stockton College. Now, in 1855, right before he left Mizzou, Shannon and two members of the Missouri faculty traveled to Lexington, Missouri to attend the annual Lexington Slaveholders Convention. And there he addressed the assembled crowd of slave owners. And his tone was familiar. His message, a fiery defense of the actions of Southern slave owners and the threat of violence, the promise of violence if a system like slavery were ever challenged, was a familiar tone. But his fire was on obvious display in that address. Of abolitionists, Shannon said, "I fear them not. I hurl proud defiance in the viper teeth of abolitionism, and I assure them one and all that should the day arrive when my labors shall be needed, I shall without a moment's hesitation draw the sword of the Spirit, a true Damascus blade as was ever forged in the armory of heaven. I shall neither ask nor give quarter till this battle is fought and the victory won, and the friends of the Constitution and the rights of the South lie buried in a common grave that entombs the liberties of our country." Like many hawkish Southerners and slavery defenders at the time, Shannon seemed to relish the possibility of armed conflict, but he also seemed completely oblivious to the possible consequences of pending armed conflict. And that's the glee that which he talked about the opportunity to engage in conflict was obvious. He said later in his address, "Let us, fellow citizens, be united, be vigilant. Let us husband our resources, concentrate our energies, and exhaust all peaceable means to protect our rights and save the Union. Let us hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And then, we having done all that honorable man can do to save the Union, if dilution is forced upon us by those domestic traitors, then I, for one, say in the language of the distinguished Georgia statesman and patriot, having exhausted the argument, we will stand to arms. Our motto will be this: God will defend the right. Our consolation, if Rome must fall, then we are innocent." Shannon and his ilk were driving us toward a war that they claimed they did not want, and whose human cost literally seemed unimaginable at the time to most people. And frankly, he was not alone. Even 5 or so years later, when Fort Sumter fell and the nation began preparing for war in earnest, some people still seemed oblivious to the consequences of our failure to deal with the question of slavery. For example, the fact that the only casualty at Fort Sumter was a Confederate horse was a great comfort to some people. They thought this was how war was going to be. Separation would be easy. Secession would be fun. Confederate Congressman and later Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker very famously pulled out a handkerchief on the floor of Congress and said that he would personally go to the battlefield and clean up all the blood spilled with his handkerchief. I would love to see a scientific study of how big the handkerchief would have to be to make that happen. It's also worth mentioning that even those few people that were talking about the dire consequences of the erosion of national unity were not listened to. I think about William Tecumseh Sherman. In December of 1860, Sherman was commandant of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Training. That name does not roll off the tongue. He wrote in his journal how he cried when he heard of the news of the secession of South Carolina. And he wrote, "You people of the South don't know what you are doing. The country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how this will end. It is folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing." Sherman predicted to a newspaper reporter that casualties might reach near 100,000. And that prediction made him seen as mentally unstable. And his superiors, his benefactors, really thought that if he maintained his position at the college with that public statement of such a large number of casualties, that he would be embarrassed. So they pulled his command. He was just removed from that position. He was seen as unstable for suggesting that such an awful thing could have happened. And then, of course, over a year later, he would find himself commanding a corps at Shiloh and seeing firsthand the kind of slaughter that he said was going to happen. More than 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, but it certainly seemed to catch everyone off guard in 1861. This was the worst war perhaps the world had ever seen, and the carnage to come would prove both Shannon's prediction and Sherman's prediction to be nothing short of tragic. We know now today that Sherman's prediction was low by 500,000, and he was thought unstable for predicting that. And yet they fought on both sides. They bled and died in unprecedented numbers that we've never seen before or since in North America. And that's really, I think, one of the reasons why we feel such a great attachment to the Civil War in our cultural and historical memory. How did a country whose people had so much in common heap such violence upon each other? And how did they sustain themselves through that violence for 4 long years? And then how did they process that violence in the years after? And I think Frederick Douglass's comments in the Decoration address that we just heard gives us a suggestion of how they did that. As we heard him say a minute ago, those unknown heroes whose whitened bones have been piously gathered here, and whose green graves we now strew with sweet and beautiful flowers, choice emblems alike of pure hearts and brave spirits, reached in their glorious career the highest point of nobleness beyond which human power cannot go. They died for their country. Douglas, like so many others at the time, was searching for a larger, higher purpose to explain all this loss. He went on further to say, if we ought to forget a war which has filled our land with widows and orphans, which has made stumps of men of the very flower of youth, I'll skip ahead. I say, if this war is to be forgotten, what shall we remember? What Douglas was asking us to remember was the cause. Having a cause to sustain us is what seemed to get America through the war, what seemed to get soldiers through the war, and looking ahead to more serene days. You know, if you look at Civil War soldiers' letters, you'll see repeated references to duty and country. And I think sometimes people see those letters and they think that smacks of sort of generic platitude, the kind of things that soldiers wrote because they felt they had to. I've never felt that way. I've always felt that these soldiers were telling themselves what they needed to tell themselves to be able to push through, to seek that higher cause. We mentioned the Ken Burns miniseries and the Ashokan Farewell. One of the things that I think is relevant to this conversation, if you saw the Ken Burns series those years ago, you probably remember the Sullivan-Ballou letter. One of the great letters that's ever been written, I think. If you're not familiar with that, please Google it. Shortly before his death at the First Battle of Bull Run, Sullivan-Ballou wrote a letter to his wife. And he spoke about duty. He spoke about cause. He said to his wife, I have no misgivings about or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am now engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization leans on the triumph of government, and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt. It was the need to find and preserve a cause that seemed to sustain so many soldiers as they faced the threat of death, like Sullivan-Ballou did. It was this cause that Mr. Lincoln spoke of at Gettysburg in November of 1863, when he declared, as I read a minute ago, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. And it was the common cause that Mr. Lincoln spoke of on November 21st, 1864, when he wrote his famous letter to Miss Lydia Bixby of Boston. I should pause and note, in the interest of full disclosure, we aren't 100% certain if he actually wrote that letter to Miss Lydia Bixby of Boston, but it's a great letter, and let's just roll with it as if we know it's true, even though we're not entirely certain. Miss Bixby, of course, possibly lost as many as 5 sons in combat. And after an aide brought that to his attention, Mr. Lincoln allegedly wrote her the following letter, and it's short, so I'll read it because it's quite lovely. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously in the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln. A profound understanding of the loss the nation suffered, mixed with pride and dedication to an unfinished higher cause, marks the writings about loss and mourning during and after the Civil War. I think about Private A.W. Harlan of the 21st Missouri Union Infantry. This was a regiment that formed in Canton and in and around Canton in the summer of 1861. And they would eventually be among the most well-traveled Union regiments in the war. They saw action at Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, Tupelo, Nashville. and were heavily involved in some serious combat throughout the war. They had an anniversary event in September of 1892 in Edina, Missouri. And Private A.W. Harlan wrote a poem for the day to celebrate the history of the 21st. And I'll briefly read it. It's fairly short. I'm reading too much, but I think this is a good one. So this was the poem that Private Harlan wrote, and he read in Edina that day. As we grasp old comrades by the hand, the tears unbidden flow, and memory swiftly calls us back to some 30 years ago, when with but one blanket to our back, as we lay upon the snow, and slowly munched our last hardtack nearly 30 years ago, and talked of scenes of mortal strife through which we've had to go, thinking of home and the dear wife, while time moved on so slow. And as we passed the lone graveyards, where all in time must go, we often think of those lonely graves made some 30 years ago. Think of the breastworks we charged, where the dead so thickly lay, and how we tumbled them into the trench, the blue as well as the gray. We seem to hear the long roll beat that warns us of the foe, then hear them sound their own retreat, and it's all peace here below. And when we've heard the last roll call, seen our last of earthly scenes, with our old blue coat for a pall, we'll finally lay down to pleasant dreams. And with that flag forever flying over us, that blessed emblem of the free, we'll all join in the immortal chorus and help sound the Jubilee. The country had been split in two. The divisions that had been building for so long were coming to a crisis point, yet somehow people didn't think it would get that bad. Some did, some relished the opportunity, but I think for a lot of Americans, this surprised them. Even when events became more chaotic and the political system began to break down, people still couldn't fathom the carnage to come. And once that carnage did arrive, Americans grieved and would continue to grieve for decades at what was taken from them, not just the lives, but the illusion of safety, the sense that the system was strong and would always work no matter the challenge. To cope with these losses and restore that sense of faith in system, they reminded themselves during and after the war that they were part of a larger cause. Letters from politicians, letter from soldiers, letter from civilians during that time, they all speak of higher causes. Not all, but many of them. And it seems like having that larger cause is what got everyone through. So perhaps this is what we need to think about right now. Certainly our national loss regarding political issues doesn't approach the level of a civil war. Sadly, our loss due to COVID is unfortunately approaching that level, but our political losses don't seem to compare. However, we do have a similar sense of loss in the security of the system, the faith that it will continue, the faith that we can survive any challenge. And I think we have to remember that larger cause is what we need to perhaps hang our hats on. We also need to remember, I think, 620,000 people perished, but the Union did hold together. The national bonds bent, but they didn't break. So it is today, excuse me. After 4 years of national division, after 4 years of Donald J. Trump, after a divisive election, even an insurrection at the nation's capital, which I certainly never imagined happening in my lifetime. Simultaneously, it all feels unfathomable, but because of the example of the Civil War, somehow tragically familiar. And we all find ourselves in a place where we are scared and nervous and grieving. But like Mr. Lincoln asked us at Gettysburg, and like Frederick Douglass challenged us to do at Arlington, and even as Private A.W. Harlan reminded us at Edina, Missouri, remembering our larger cause is perhaps our best chance of getting through. The system didn't work perfectly, but it worked. The election was a mess and it was divisive, but ultimately it had a legitimate outcome and a peaceful transfer of power. So in some ways, the bedrock of the American system has survived. Once again, maybe we bent a bit, but we didn't break. So as we deal with the continued division, as we struggle with the unthinkable things that have happened repeatedly recently, we need to take comfort in the fact that the system certainly has been through worse, that the nation certainly has been through worse, and that we have found ways to get through it. Lincoln told us at Gettysburg that it was our task to ensure that the dead did not die in vain. Perhaps it is our task to ensure that the Capitol insurrection and the loss of life that came with it and the blow to national confidence that came with it did not happen in vain. It needs to be a motivator of action rather than a sign of future collapse. Now, I'm not, bold enough to claim that I know how to do that, but I'm pretty sure it's going to look an awful lot like hard work. It's going to look an awful lot like dedication to local organizing, activism, pressing legislatures to act aggressively to protect voting rights, protect elections, and generally pledging ourselves to defend democracy from people that think that it can or should be casually tossed aside. So in conclusion, since we started with the words of slavery defender and college president James Shannon, I thought it was fitting to close with the words of another college president. This time, Union Civil War hero Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry. I'm sure many of you probably know the name. Chamberlain perhaps saved the entire Union cause by leading the defense at Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg. After the war, he was promoted to brigadier general, eventually served as governor of Maine, Maine, that's right, governor of Maine. And then eventually he was president of Bowdoin College. And while he was president of Bowdoin, he wrote a lot about how we should think of the sacrifice of the war and the cause that we must stay dedicated to in order to honor that memory. And he wrote, while he was president of Bowdoin, "It is something great and greatening to cherish an ideal, to act in the light of truth that is far away and far above, to set aside the near advantage, the momentary pleasure, the snatching of seeming good to self, and to act for remoter ends, for higher good, and for interests other than our own. The cause we fought for was higher. Our thought is wider, and our thought is our power." Thank you very much.